If you're not familiar, the team that built the Sticky Studio product is actually the team behind Kumu. So Kumu is a web-based platform for mapping networks and systems. When the pandemic hit, we had put our heads together around what are the kind of tools and offerings, what's our unique contribution that we could create as people got shifted into this world of kind of all being on individual rectangles on screens. We used to be able to do these sorts of processes that were all in person. And that's where we moved towards Sticky Studio. So Sticky Studio is basically our solution for how do we move towards a simpler, easier to use approach to making sense of complex issues and doing this in such a way that is much easier to learn, far more simple, still has the focus on relationships that Kumu does, but allows that to actually happen in a real-time kind of live participatory environment, and then can actually be easily exported and pulled into Kumu if you then need to do things like changing the visual style, moving into a bit more of a presentation and a storytelling mode. And so happy to kind of walk through and show you some of those steps and what it looks like to export from Sticky and bring it into Kumu towards the end of the conversation. But let's dive in. Let me just kind of show you a bit of what Sticky Studio is, how it works. So the basics for us is really trying to simplify. So what do people need when they're using a tool like this? They definitely need stickies. And so how do we make it really easy to be able to drag stickies onto the board? And if you're on there, you can see wherever I drag these, you're seeing this move around. We've tried to, once you place a sticky, make it really easy to create connections between stickies, but not just between stickies, to kind of any other content that's on the map. Because so much of the folks that we're trying to have use Sticky Studio, it's not just like, hey, let's have a huge bucket of ideas, but really, how can we move to that next level where we're actually trying to say, hey, how are these ideas connected? What leads to what? How are these influencing each other? And so if you hover on any sticky, you'll see these little, what we call connection anchors, and you can just drag from those and drop on any other sticky to be able to connect. If instead that you wanted to actually be able to drag from these and drop onto an image, you can do that. In terms of editing text on a sticky, just double click to be able to start typing. So if you click on any sticky note, double click, and that enters you into the edit mode. If you're having any challenge with that, if you come and click on a sticky and then click this edit icon at the top, that'll also enter you into that mode too. So you can type your question like that. And when you hit enter, it then saves that. And if you need to resize it, you can just kind of drag the sticky to resize back and forth. We also do have some of the scaffolding through shapes that you might be used to with other tools. So say you do want to define section down at the bottom, we can actually grab this square, drop it anywhere we want. And then if we zoom in, we can actually click on this and then resize it. And this might be an area that you have for grouping people's questions or doing an enablers and an inhibitors analysis. And then you might drag a label onto this, and we might say, enablers. And so there's some of that scaffolding that you can do. We've just tried to say, how can we keep it pretty simple by just offering the kind of square rectangle shape, the circle oval shape, and then the line shape, so that you can create a little of the scaffolding that feels like it's needed for your group. With the labels, you can change the size of this as well. So there's 3 different tiers to give you a little bit of that visual hierarchy. So this bottom tier is paragraph text. This one is kind of a standard heading, and this would be more of a title option. Images as well, you see we've dropped some GIFs in here. You can do other backgrounds that you might place stickies on top of, and just click this button and you'll be able to go find that information. And then the last option you'll see here where there's a thumb, if you click this, you'll actually see a listing of a number of different emoji reactions. What you can do if you select any of these, it'll change. You can kind of drag that and drop it on any sticky. So it's kind of our version of voting. If you wanted to do a more standard kind of sticky dot voting like you might do in the room, you can go select that purple icon and then drag this onto any one of the stickies. As a neat added bonus, you can also drag your own avatar. Once you customize your avatar, it'll have your image show up. So you can actually drag your avatar as a vote onto it if you want to actually use more of an identity-based voting. That also becomes possible. But the goal there was kind of twofold. One is, can we actually have a bit of the joy of the more organic approach to how people do this with sticky dots in the room, where you just kind of start to see a visual sense of what has the most votes, then also bring a little bit more kind of joy into it by having the emoji reactions and different options that you can use for how do you then kind of crowd in input on some of the different stuff that that you're mapping and that you're creating. If you click on any of the stickies, you'll notice, or hover on any of the stickies, you'll notice there's this comment icon that appears. So if you click on that, that'll actually bring up a comment thread. And the goal here is, one of the things we noticed is that sometimes how some of the other collaborative whiteboards were used was heavy usage when we're all in a live session like this, but then it was primarily used for that purpose, instead of a lot of the ways that we see people using Kumu is they are trying to make sense of complex issues over time. And so having some way to have a little bit more context or conversation or back and forth related to the things that you're mapping end up being really important. And so you'll see down here, if I click on this one, we have a comment icon showing there's comments here. If I click on it, someone's added a comment down here. And so we can do replies back and forth and actually have either more depth, more context there, or people being able to ask some questions. So when you think about basic functionality, try to keep it really, really simple. Make it so that you're not kind of overwhelmed with features and functionality, and you have a UI which actually encourages you to think about what are the connections among the different things that I'm mapping. If you were, for example, building out, let's say, like a network map really quickly, you can just double click on the background. That'll automatically create a sticky. If you don't want that to be pink, you can come up here and click change color, switch to blue, and then we'll remember that the kind of last action that you did. And now as I drag and drop, I'll create another blue connection. So it's a really quick way to be able to build out a structure. For example, if you're doing a causal loop diagram, you can imagine like a really rough way to build that out quickly. Yeah, what makes Sticky Studio unique? In terms of kind of uniqueness of Sticky Studio, I would say first is just our admonition that there's a lot of overlap. So a lot of the functionality that you have in Sticky Studio is similar to those in those other tools. And so the differentiating factors for us are a couple. One is like simplicity and ease of use. So how can we strip down the options that you have to make it a more enjoyable and easier to use experience? And the principle that informed us was around kind of what do we use when we're in the room? And can we actually make do with like the basics that we end up like with Sharpies and with drawing some shapes and some sticky notes and some stickers? And so how can we try to recreate that without adding too much additional in? There's also then this focus on have relationships be much more of a like a first-class citizen, in that we're really prioritizing the ability to create relationships because we think that's so important. And then the other one is this notion of, can we have it be a little bit more supportive of asynchronous instead of just kind of like live parallel sessions? And so that's where comments come in. There may be additional features that we develop over time around things like changes logs or other sorts of commenting that allow that conversation to live on in a robust way. We do also have, there's a new kind of experimental feature up here in this top corner, what's called huddles. So if you click this, it allows you to go into an audio only mode where you're collaborating. So if you didn't want to be using Zoom, but you want to invite people into a board and just have them be able to talk, this makes it so you can kind of do that meeting within the Sticky Studio board rather than having to rely on a Zoom meeting as well. So let me change and just show you a little bit in terms of some other examples of building out in Sticky Studio. So for example, a systems mapping, right, example. A lot of the times when people are trying to create these maps, the challenge ends up being, if let's say you're even learning how to do something like a causal loop diagram to begin with, which is looking at the factors that are involved in a complex problem and kind of what the connections might be, you're already learning some trickier kind of concepts and language and framing, and having to learn a tool on top of that hasn't always played well together. And so that's where, when people are getting used to doing both of those, learning Kumu and learning systems mapping at the same time, what I would think about Sticky Studio for is kind of the messier earlier parts of this process, where you're trying to think about what are all the different factors involved? What are some of the initial connections? What are the causal fragments? Or if you have an approach where you're starting to build kind of loops, like you're focused on loops and thinking about all the different loops that exist, this being kind of a nice way, and then allowing like you to be able to see what other people are working on and be able to ask questions, and kind of create more of that generative dialogue. In terms of trying to do things like reinforcing loop labels, that one is basically right now just done with the label function. So you're just creating sticky notes and then these relationships between sticky notes, and then just adding by dragging this label. That's the essence of how you kind of do this sort of functionality within Sticky Studio. And then this could be exported into Kumu, and then we can create some of the more formal structure. We also so you can think about in terms of stakeholder mapping, right? One of the ways people tend to use Sticky Studio would be more in this like how do we use things like the circle shapes to create some scaffolding for people to do brainstorms? So this is just like a quick template example showing you if you were looking at and kind of working on a new project, you might do an initial first sort of who are the core versus the peripheral stakeholders, what are each of those stakeholder groups, and then maybe use sticky notes to actually start identifying specific individuals within each group. And then you can come through and actually start to identify any relationships that you have. And maybe you can actually click on here and add a little bit more context or add a comment about that relationship that allows you then to be able to have some of that depth and start to think about, okay, who might we involve, or like what's our understanding of who's who or who's kind of important or influential in the space. You'll see here on this left side, we've kind of just made our own legend. So with those 4 colors, you can imagine kind of creating some sort of heuristic on your own about how you use those colors. But yeah, you could get creative about how you use the circles and structures to try to allow Sticky Studio to support whatever brainstorms are that you need. Another example, looking more at like how do images come on the board and be popular. So we have the SDG toolkit that we created that was a map on Kumu, but this is an example of where we can actually bring those images in to Sticky Studio and have it be kind of a more brainstorming function around, hey, who's working on what, right? What are the orgs that are involved on each of the different SDGs? Again, this is just a kind of a mock example, or like, hey, let's use labels for the projects and then connect the partners that are working on each project and then tie that in. So we can start to create a bit of a visual map on in our specific community or area, kind of who's working on what has projects like connected to them or not. And how can we have this be kind of the initial, like maybe messier sort that we use to then crowdsource some of that wisdom in. Any board can be turned into a template. So if I go back to the boards and I come down to templates, we just have a really initial section of templates that are available here right now. And so you can click on any of these and then kind of be dropped down into an initial starting point for a board. You can turn any board that you have into a template as well. So for example, if I said, hey, I actually want this to become a template that all of you could use, if I click create template, I can convert this to a template, call this the SDG toolkit, like stakeholder mapping template, and then convert it. You can then click on that link and then be able to use, you'll just have the use template option. I have the edit template option because I'm an owner. But then you can click use that template and then kind of build on it from there. And so try to make it really easy, knowing that like a lot of times especially if you're a facilitator, right, you might have a common set of structures that you use as you're walking groups through certain things. And so can we still do some of that, like that scaffolding that allows you to not have to recreate those from scratch? You might have use cases where you need a little bit more control over who can access that link and how. So if you click this icon in the upper right corner, it gives you some of the options around kind of how and who can edit the board. So the defaults here are, hey, is it a no access board? Is it a view only board? Is it a comment only board? Or is it actually full edit, which means like editing, moving, adding, deleting, kind of full access there. There's also, so you can make those changes and still use a link. If you want to actually have it be invite only, where you actually basically have to sign into Sticky Studio to be able to access that, you can change that if you want. So you click invite instead, and then I'll change to a different mode where you're actually inviting people in via email address. And so that's kind of the most secure option. You might have also noticed as you're starting to hover on any of the avatars, as you hover, you can actually see kind of who created and added what on the board. So you can see some of that, that content and that context. Pricing wise, and so we have a free tier which is up to 5 boards, which includes like a good chunk of the functionality. If you are on a paid plan, it's $5 per month, and then basically you get to create unlimited boards. You get access to things like comments, the invite only links. There's that kind of tiering between this early kind of first tier that gives you access to a limited number of boards, and then basically a $5 per month model which gets you unlimited access to everything. There is the ability to export. So if you go into this menu in the upper left corner, you can click export. There's a couple different options for how that works. The primary one, right, is Kumu. There's also, if you want to export an actual like PDF of the board, you can do that as well. And if you click export here to Kumu, this basically creates a JSON file, which can be imported into Kumu. Let's take the systems mapping example. So if I was to come in here and then click export and then export that to Kumu, we will create a project on Kumu. You can pick any template you want, or you can just like, if you've already created a template before and you're in an existing map, this is the screen that you'd have. You could also choose restore backup if you wanted. But instead, if we import here and just choose the JSON file, we can come back and choose this file and then click import. And then now we'll have that here within Kumu. Looks pretty similar. The difference is some of the connection curvature we don't have completely dialed in, so it's exactly the same. So you might have to clean up a little bit when you import. You'll see we've tried to recreate a bit of the styling that is the default within Sticky Studio, but some of that may be things that you don't want. And so there's some changes you can do within the basic editor. Also within our advanced editor, for example, we can just take away that note. And so it's not squares anymore, it's circles, and it's starting to get to look a little bit more similar to what you'd expect from Kumu. And then these are all pinned in place, so we can still move them around, but it's a one-way export essentially from Sticky Studio into Kumu. So once it's in here, then any further changes that you're making in Sticky Studio would end up having to be re-exported again and pushed over into Kumu. If you wanted to kind of get signed up and start playing around, just again, visit sticky.studio. If you're logged in, it'll take you right into your boards. If not, it'll take you to this page. You can read a little bit more about it. We have this try option. If you go to sticky.studio/try, it just drops you straight into a board. You can just start playing around with and creating. Just make sure you actually kind of sign up to save any of the content. This is just meant to be a kind of a really quick way to get you in and playing around with and using the tool. If there's any other questions that come up, happy to reach out to our team. You can reach out to kind of support@kumu.io or support@sticky.studio as well. So appreciate you taking the time to hop in and learn a little bit more about Sticky Studio. And yeah, would just love any feedback that you have, any questions around is this possible or not, or even too, if you said like, hey, I would love to use this, it's close, here's the stuff that I need to feel like I can really make the jump into using Sticky Studio. That's all super helpful feedback for where we are with the product right now. So thank you again. And yeah, looking forward to seeing how you jump in and what you end up building with the platform.